Hi everybody, and welcome to our first virtual class. We are going to be discussing poetry today. Probably something that you're all kind of familiar with, but I'm hoping by the end of this lesson, not only will you be more versed in poetry in general, but on this very specific kind that we're going to try our hand in a little bit later. Let's start off with a review about what we already know about poetry. For some of us, we might know more than others, and that's okay. We all come to class with different sets of knowledge. But over here on the side, you can see some of the aspects of poetry that I've listed that are pretty common. So a lot of people know that poems have rhyme schemes, that they can follow a certain formatting. That means the stanzas have to be a certain length, and it has to be a certain number of stanzas. Maybe you think that poems contain lots of literary devices, like what we've talked about in previous lessons, such as imagery or hyperbole, or maybe they are using metaphor and simile. Another thing about poems is some of them have length requirements. They have to be a certain number of syllables long, a certain number of stanzas long. Sometimes they have to be written syllabically, so that means like iambic pentameter, meaning 10 syllables per line. Maybe you know about certain poets. Maybe you're familiar with Shakespeare or Dickens or Whitman. Maybe you've heard of Byron, Keats, or Currer. So maybe you think poetry is all about frilly, pretty language that's really hard to understand. But whatever your preconceived notions about poetry are, I think that you're going to learn something new today. Let's start by reading this poem by Natsume Soseki. Over the wintry forests, winds howl in rage with no leaves to blow. As we look at this poem, it's very short, right? Only 3 lines long. Syllables in here, over the wintry. That's 5. So our first line is 5 syllables. Let's look at the second line. Forest, winds howl in rage. That's 7. With no leaves to blow. 5. So let's think about which poems we know have 3 lines and are written in a 5-7-5 format. We will find out soon what this is. But before we get too deep into it, I just want to review the content and language objectives from this mini lesson. First, students will be able to distinguish haiku from other forms of poetry and note its creator and the requirements. So if you didn't know, that poem that we just read is haiku. The second content objective is going to be students will be able to create their own haiku at the end of the lesson. That's right, you're going to get to write your own haiku. I hope you're all very excited. And our language objectives, individually, students will summarize their understanding of haiku poetry at the end of the lesson. Next to this video, you will see our Google form. There is where you will answer the quiz questions that go along with this video that relates to our first language objective. And secondly, students will be able to compare the feature of haiku to other forms of poetry. So you'll now know what haikus require in terms of length, syllables, content, and then you'll be able to see how they differ from other forms of poetry. So a little bit of background here on haiku. Matsuo Basho is considered to be the father of haiku. Originally, he named this haku, and it was changed centuries later. We're not really sure why the name was changed. But the baseline for haikus remain the same. They're inspired by nature. They're usually written in present tense rather than past or future. They use descriptive language, not telling, so think lots of imagery. They include the senses, again relating back to imagery, and they can be written in a series. Now, don't think that just because it says inspired by nature, written in series, that you need to be really fancy with your haiku. They're more about seeing something and wanting to say something about it. So before you begin to write a haiku, these are some of the stages you may want to go through and consider. First, brainstorm. Before you begin writing about anything, it's always a good idea to brainstorm and get your ideas out there. So think about topics, words related to it, and things that you might want to put in your haiku. For example, if I wanted to write a haiku about the mountains, I would start by jotting down words that I associate with mountains and images that come to my mind. Remember, the format has to be 5 syllables in the first line, 7 in the second, and then 5 in the third. And remember that the message is usually about nature and that your haiku does not need to rhyme. To give you a little more inspiration before you begin writing your own haiku, let's look at these two examples. The first one reads, "Even with distance, the world feels painfully close, but hope turns the page." Now that's not necessarily about nature, but it is very pertinent to what's happening for us right now. And then the second haiku says, "The wind is blowing, the leaves rustle in rhythm to nature's heartbeat." That's a more traditional take on haiku, kind of talking about nature, how it has its own life force, and just stating that observation that this author made about what they find beautiful in the natural world. So real quick, you can leave this page up while you're writing your haiku to present in our next class, but these are just your little reminders, your tips and tricks for haiku. And now it's your turn. Now if we were in person, I would only have us take a couple minutes to do this, but you're going to have the whole night to complete this for homework, and then next time in class we will share our haikus. So these will be your review questions on that Google form, and I can't wait to see what you learned.